Ali, thanks for
Hi.
coming over to the Global Center to talk to me.
It's always my pleasure.
We're supposed to say who we are.
Yes.
Maybe you should start.
Yes, I'm Alessandra Giannini. I used to be a climate scientist at the IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia, but now I'm a professor here at l'École Normale Supérieure in Paris.
And the Columbia PhD.
Yes.
I think you finished about the time I came.
Yeah, that's
22 years ago.
Yeah, I defended at the end of 2000. I think, yeah, I remember you.
I think I was there.
Arrived at that time, yeah.
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 Right. So I'm Adam Sobel. I've been at Columbia 22 years, and we're in the same field.
Mhm.
I'm in applied physics and applied math in the engineering school, and earth and environmental sciences, which is Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the same campus as the
Neighbors.
IRI. So we were both there for
Yeah.
many, many years before you moved here. Maybe you should say how you got to Paris.
Yes, so about 4 years ago, I guess 5 years ago, I applied for the Make Our Planet Great Again program, and I got one of the grants. And so I moved here on the promise of a 5-year project, fully funded 5-year project. And then soon thereafter, they opened the position, I think totally unrelated to me being here, because I imagine these things take time, opening faculty positions. But I applied, I went through the regular concours in France, and I became a professor at l'École Normale Supérieure.
Right. So the Make the Planet Great Again was the thing where Macron was trying to
Countering-
rescue American climate scientists when Trump...
Yeah, countering the Make America Great Again.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So in our case, it was, ENS gain is Columbia's loss maybe, but
Yeah.
glad you're still connected here.
Exactly. I still maintain the affiliation in any case, so it's always open. I think there's so many different ways to collaborate nowadays. This place is really a meeting point.
Yeah.
There's an alliance between Columbia and universities in Paris, so
Yeah.
And,
And you're
all
still
these
back-
issues are global in any case, so yeah.
I feel like I see you about as often as I used to. It seems like you're back on campus some amount of...
Usually in summer now because I teach. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we had some topics lined up to talk about, but before that, I thought maybe we were having an interesting conversation at lunch the other day, and I thought it would be interesting for the audience, whoever they are, to hear about your experiences trying to bring students here to the COP, the Conferences of the Parties, the International Climate Negotiation, which is in Egypt
Yeah.
this
it's in
year. That was a
Egypt,
good story.
Yes, it's in 3 weeks now, I think.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so we're really working hard at it because the logistics are not clear yet. Over summer we had long discussions. So ENS actually has official accreditation as a RINGO, which means a Research and Independence NGO. And so I guess the students, so we select I don't know if it's unique to ENS, but what we do is that we send students. So we make it a student project. And we select students, and then we go with them, like some professors accompany the students to the COP.
And what would they do? I mean,
They
I've
can
wondered
actually
this.
observe. So if they're Ringo, you can observe the negotiations.
The actual negotiation.
So, you know, I've never been to the COP. What I
Right.
understand
Me
is
neither.
that there's an official side, which is called the Blue Zone, and then a sort of unofficial, more like NGO or meeting point side event side is called the Green Zone. So with the accreditation, you can actually go into the Blue Zone and observe the negotiations.
Loss and damage, and all of these things. Yeah, the
adaptation,
actual
financial
real.
instruments. Yeah.
But then there's also, I understand, there's all kinds of other events going on there that might be
these side
interesting.
events in the Green Zone.
Yeah.
So I think, we spent a lot of time over summer discussing how to get there.
Right.
And we're still in the process of trying to minimize our carbon footprint getting there. The students are very adamant, conscientious about this issue here in France. I don't know if it's the same globally, but...
I guess I haven't brought undergraduates on trips, so I don't know, but I think it's probably less the case in the US as here that, as you described it to me, the students simply don't want to fly at all.
Ideally not, yeah. So last year the students who went to Glasgow managed to go by train and bus, I think.
Right.
But this year it's in Sharm el Sheikh.
It's a little harder.
initially, I shouldn't laugh because it's serious issues and it's the future.
No, I know.
And so initially they went as far as proposing to go on a sailboat. But then, then you have to cross issues of carbon emissions with issues of safety and security, and also how much time you can take off studying to go to the COP and come back.
Yeah.
And so then the idea is to try and optimize how far to go by train and then take one flight to Sharm el-Sheikh.
I mean, as we were also discussing, I mean, in our field, many of us have a history of traveling quite a lot for scientific conferences and stuff. And I think we are, certainly I myself am becoming much more conscious of it and trying not to get on a plane for reasons that in the past I might have. So the students are ahead of us,
Yeah. Well, in Europe it's easier. I mean, the trains are so much more comfortable and pleasant, and you can get places where you're really actually optimizing also,
Yeah. Well, in the U.S. the trains aren't so good, but to go from New York, if you go to Boston or D.C. or anywhere in between, the Amtrak actually is okay, so I do that. But other than that, it's not so. Yeah. It's not so easy as it is here. All right. Anyway, so the thing I really wanted to talk to you about, because you're an expert on it, and also because it came up recently in our discussions back home with our colleagues that you and I both know at Columbia, is the history of drought in the Sahel region of Africa and the different kinds of human influences on it. And to give a little context, so I'll give a little context and then...
Yeah, you should give the context.
Yeah, and then of how we came to be having this conversation. And then I think it would be good if you describe your work on it, which you've done for many years. So what happened was in our research group at Lamont at Columbia, we recently had an email conversation. Without going into how it came about, we have an active group and we sometimes have heated discussions by email. And one of them was about the role of Jule Charney. So Jule Charney was one of the great scientists of the 20th century in our field.
Dynamic meteorologist,
climate scientist we would now maybe say. But Charney was one of the main people who invented numerical weather prediction, which is how weather prediction on computers, which is how we do it today. Excuse me. And he did a lot of other great things in the field, including being the lead author of the Charney report, which became was like the predecessor of the IPCC reports, the first report that's that had some official weight and some kind of backing of the U.S. government that said climate change is a problem. It came up with estimates of how much warming we would experience from a given increase in CO2, which are still pretty much right.
Yeah.
Even though the technology they had was very primitive by today's standards.
It's pretty impressive, This pretty 3 degrees plus or minus 1.5 of warming, right? And
for a doubling
of CO2.
CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. 3 degrees Celsius plus or minus 1.5 temperature increase. And that was in 1979 that came out. So Charney was already... that was only a few years before he died. Actually died in the early 80s. But he, besides inventing numerical weather prediction and just a tremendous amount of theoretical advances in the field, and was a big... And many of the great leaders in the field after that were his students, including your thesis advisor, Mark Kane, who's also a mentor of mine, emeritus at Columbia, and many other people. So it just had a tremendous influence. But what the conversation was about how, Charney did all those things, but he did some things that, in hindsight, don't look so great, too. And one of them was that he wrote a paper also in the late 70s, I think.
No, maybe earlier,
maybe early 70s.
75.
Okay, about the Sahel region of Africa. So I'll give my brief perception of the history, and then I'll stop. So in the 70s and into the 80s, there was a terrible drought and famines in the Sahel. The Sahel is the region of West Africa between the Guinea coast, which is kind of humid, rainy region, with the coast facing south, and the Sahara Desert to the north. So in between, it's sort of pretty dry, but not completely dry. And there's a rainy season that's basically the Northern Hemisphere summer. And that's when it rains, and that's when all the agriculture that people live on, it's mostly subsistence agriculture area.
Maybe we can get back to that.
We'll get back to that. Okay, you can correct
Yeah,
me if I
maybe
got
at
that wrong.
Chinese time it was.
In Chinese time,
Yeah.
okay. And so it either rains or it doesn't. Sometimes the monsoon doesn't make it there so well, and then there's drought and famine, and that happened a lot in the 70s and 80s. And Charney wrote a paper that said, in essence, maybe the reason for this drought is that the land has been overgrazed, such that there's less
Or cleared of vegetation.
vegetation, yeah, so that there's less vegetation on the surface, and that causes the surface to be brighter, like when seen from space. What we say, the albedo
Yeah,
is
that's a
higher.
nice way to say that in non-jargony terms.
Right, we're going to try to do it in non-jargony terms. And that by a series of processes, atmospheric dynamical processes, that was really the point of his paper, was to talk about those processes. That change in the surface of the land could have caused the drought. And he had a very simple model, mathematical model of this, and he expressed all the uncertainties, and he said we don't really know and we should do more research, but he put that idea out there. And that idea then got a lot of traction. A lot of people started to believe it, maybe more even than Charney himself did. And then your research has been critical in convincing, I think, most of the field that Charney was wrong about this. And that's scientifically, even though the physics he was talking about is active but didn't really cause it. And so politically, the implication of that is that we shouldn't blame the people in the region for having caused this drought, whereas Charney's paper kind of suggested that maybe we should, even though that didn't really, he didn't put it in those terms, but it came to be seen in those terms later. So I want to stop there and get your accounting of how you got into this topic and the work you did on it and what's happened since then.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as we were discussing this offline, we both went back to Charney's papers of the 74, 75, 76 to see if there were any clues as to why he got interested into this issue. Not clear at all. But in any case, so the 70s and the 80s were anomalously dry in the Sahel, meaning that precipitation year after year was below what the perceived normal was. And so specifically, 72, 73 was a very dry year, perhaps the first big drought. And so maybe, I don't know where the connection is there, but it's close enough to the Chinese papers. And so it may have been in the news, I don't know, that's really a topic for historians of science.
But the number of deaths, over the succeeding years were tremendous, right?
I don't know much about those estimates. What I recall reading about, and I think, is that the droughts in the 70s, because they were so unexpected, especially because in fact they came right after, or they kind of signaled the end of what perhaps in the end is going to be what the most anomalous period in the 20th century, which was the very wet period that preceded the droughts in the 50s and 60s. They had more of an impact on societies and the environment, let's say, than the ones in the 80s, because after the droughts in the 70s, there was a response, or at least a concerted action to ensure that devastation didn't repeat itself. And so
international assistance of some kind, or
everything from food aid, as you could say, or establishing international agencies and networks to monitor food security. So even though the droughts in the early 80s possibly were even worse in terms of climate, the climatic anomaly, in general terms, I think it's understood that they didn't have the same impact on society and the environment, on society, let's say. And so, how did I get into this? I was trying to think of an interesting way to, because it's been a while, I don't recall exactly. I recall that the first paper I read about this, I was still an undergraduate in Italy.
Oh, really?
And I was doing my undergraduate thesis, and it was the early 90s. I came across a paper by Shu and Shukla that revisited Charney's studies.
Shukla was also one of Charney's students.
Yeah, and I think he's done a lot of work. And on this subject, and in any case, and some reason that caught my attention. I want to say maybe make a connection, like an extrapolation. Early 90s in Milan, in Italy. In 91 there was the first festival of African cinema, so I had all these images of the Sahel that came from the movies of Idrissa Ouedraogo, Solomani Cissé, Ousmane Sembene. So I kind of knew where to place the region.
Right.
So I don't know if that's
know this part of the story. Okay.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. I don't know. Yeah, and it was also the time that Italy kind of opened up to migration. You could see many more people than in my youth of coming from all over the world, including sub-Saharan Africa. So, in any case, it stayed in my mind, but I kind of set it aside. I did other things for a while. Also, because Mark Kane, one of my thesis advisors, recommended I not get into it when I went for my PhD. I think he thought models were not up to par at that point, mid-90s.
Okay.
But then in the early 2000s, I kind of got back into it when I was a postdoc, and I was analyzing model simulations of the climate in a seasonal prediction context. So trying to establish how the atmosphere responds to the oceans, because it's the oceans that kind of imparts a strong influence, and those can hedge things towards more or less rainfall. I don't know if you want to explain that in...
I think we should say what models are, because it's so the models are, because sometimes we say model and people think we're talking about some sort of physical thing. They're computer software similar to what's used to predict the weather, but these are used to predict the climate. They're very complex, run on supercomputers, and simulate the climate and the atmosphere and ocean's behavior moment to moment in a very detailed way, and are used also for the projections of climate change. And so the ones you were analyzing were, by now we would consider them old, but they were much more sophisticated than what Charney had used.
Yes.
Much more realistic, much more comprehensive. So that, he was doing pencil and paper. You had lots of data put out by these supercomputer simulations that you were analyzing to try to figure out what was going on in the way that we do now.
And maybe we should back up a little bit also to say, I can claim that I kind of convincingly demonstrated the alternative hypothesis, but I didn't put that forth. In fact, there were some observational analyses that tried to match the state of the ocean with the state of Sahelian rainfall. And then there were also some model simulations with the models of the mid-80s done at the UK Met Office in a more simplified configuration, if you wish. So the idea was, if I have statistically related a certain pattern of sea surface temperatures to Sahelian drought, can I put that pattern of SST in the model sea surface temperature, and do I get the expected response?
Right.
So you can also see, I guess, in this how our understanding has advanced. It's run in parallel, as you say, and it's relevant to, Charney being one of the founders of dynamic meteorology and numerical weather prediction, that this has kind of followed also the evolution of models.
Yeah.
And so in the early 2000s, the models were still models of just the atmosphere. And then if you imposed as boundary conditions, we say, so you specified what sea surface temperatures had looked like in the real world, then the Sahel region was one region where you could match the evolution of sea surface temperatures to the evolution of rainfall.
Right. So in these models, this is a subtlety that I think is sometimes worth explaining for people outside, is that the land surface is always simulated interactively, because the land can change its temperature very quickly, and so you have to let the model internally decide what the land temperature is going to be. It goes up and down a lot just in the course of the day and the night, whereas the ocean surface temperature changes much more slowly and is often thought of as something that kind of stays static. And so the climate over the land in a place like, anywhere, it can be thought of as responding to what the ocean surface temperature is. And in the comprehensive climate models that we use to predict climate change, both the oceans and the atmosphere are now represented in an organic way, that they do their own thing and they're coupled and they talk to each other. But in these simulations, it was telling what the ocean temperatures were. So the ocean temperatures were getting warmer, of course, but there was more to it than that. There's a pattern of where it's getting a little bit warmer and a little bit less.
Okay, so then you could establish that it was the oceans that produced these droughts in the Sahel.
So why don't you just say like what the experiments looked like that showed that? I mean,
so the experiments where you ran a model of the atmosphere over sea surface temperatures, so over maps of sea surface temperature as they had been observed over the 20th century.
Right.
And so you could recover what the model simulated in terms of the evolution, the 20th century evolution of Sahel rainfall.
So you
and
put
if you
in
match that to what had been observed, you could see a pretty good correlation and match. Specifically, you could reproduce the very wet period in the 50s and 60s and then the subsequent persistence of drought in the 70s and 80s.
Right. So I think we should say this a couple different times in different ways because it's the main point. So the sea surface temperature had been evolving in time due to global warming and other factors, and it changed in a certain way. If I'm not mistaken, the key thing was that the North Atlantic warmed a little bit less than some other places around it.
Things, in retrospect, we could say. One, that the North Atlantic, there was no signal in the North Atlantic, no warming of the North Atlantic, no nothing. And other oceans, the global tropical oceans warmed, especially the Indian Ocean. That's what we kind of keyed into 20 years ago, this warming of the Indian Ocean.
But most importantly, in these experiments, we call them experiments. In our field, we don't have laboratory experiments. We can't put the Earth in a laboratory. We do it on the computer. That's what you were doing. In these experiments, you put the sea surface temperature in, you get back the drought. But critically, what you were not putting in is these patterns of land use change that Charney was blaming for the drought, or that he's interpreted as blaming for the drought. Yeah. So that showed that if to the extent these models are correct, and they gave a pretty good simulation, I think, as you said, surprisingly good in some ways at the time, it implies that whatever happened to the land surface in that time was not the reason for the drought. Therefore, you shouldn't blame Africans for their lack of rain. It was a response from the oceans. And the interesting part of that is that, there's a few interesting parts of it, but the part that the oceans didn't warm as much in the North Atlantic, which is immediately adjacent to West Africa, as elsewhere, was responsible for the bad monsoon years. Also responsible for a lull in hurricane activity, which is a different story, but interesting to me.
Related,
for some of the same reasons. And in your later work, and that of others, tell me if I get this wrong, but it's my understanding, showed that relative lack of warming in the Atlantic was also human-induced, but not because of greenhouse gases, but because of aerosol emissions from the US and Europe that cooled the surface there. So maybe you should give that story too.
Yeah, I can add a bit. Yeah, because in fact, at around the same time that the study that showed that it was sea surface temperatures that could explain the evolution of Sahelian rainfall in the 20th century, that was published. There was another article that was published that said, so this was 2003. There was an article by Rothstein and Lohmann that showed, in a more simplified way, that if you impose aerosols, so pollution, especially the sulfate aerosols, the kind that reflects insolation and so cools the surface, you could get this drought in a more idealized way. So I think that was there already. And so I remember being asked, because it was the ongoing discussion, I remember being asked at the conference, we just saw this article, and so how do you explain, since you're saying it's sea surface temperatures and they're saying it's aerosols, how do you explain? And I said, possibly aerosols affect sea surface temperatures, which affect Sahel rainfall. And so, 15, 20 years later, I think we're coming to that conclusion, because again, we are adding more complexity into models. And so now we take these multi-model ensembles that are run in support of the assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we see these same effects. As you were saying, Adam, so we have coupled ocean atmosphere models, and now what we impose as external influence is greenhouse gas concentrations, aerosol concentrations, and we get, again, Sahel drought, but with some steps in between. Let's say, like steps removed from.
And the other part that was interesting, if I remember right from your papers and your even thesis defense, I think you talked about this 20 years plus years ago, is that the change in albedo and the change in plants coverage of the planet did in fact happen, but part of that was a consequence of the drought rather than an independent thing. In other words, it rains less, so less stuff grows, and then that's part of the story. But it's not it's part human influence, but not the local human influence of the people using the land, but rather the global.
Yeah, so in fact there is that part also, because there had been this antecedent of Chinese hypothesis on that the people who ran the model simulations at NASA, they had thought about additional simulations where instead of imposing, say, what one would expect could have been the impact of humans on the surface, they removed the coupling between the atmosphere and the surface. And so in doing that, so they removed this feedback. Now we say it's so, and by removing the feedback, then you get a reduction in the amplitude of droughts and pluvials.
Right.
So in a way, so the Chinese feedback is there. It's just secondary to the oceanic influence.
Right. What the stuff Charney said happens. It's just that the causality is a little bit different. So just to summarize, and then I want to kind of go on to the next part of the story. Like, the planet is warming due to greenhouse gases, but over the North Atlantic, it's warming less because of aerosols, the little tiny particles coming out of smokestacks that cool the surface a little bit. That causes the failure of the West African monsoon, also a lull in hurricane activity, which we've since bounced back from. And so the drought is partly anthropogenic, but in a complicated way. That's not what Charney said it was. And most importantly, it puts the blame on the Western countries that are emitting all the bad stuff and not on the people in the Sahel. Nonetheless, the part that I'm not as caught up on, but I think maybe you are, is to what extent this overgrazing story lives on in the international development arena or in other spheres of activity. In other words, in the politics around this, how much has it changed to reflect the new scientific consensus, or how much hasn't it?
Yeah. It's related to, in international context, it's related to the issue of desertification.
Yeah, desertification, which is the name given to this whole story,
And so it lives on, it's, in perpetuity, it seems. There's no amount of climate science that we can throw at this subject and see that it finally, I don't know. It's a complex issue, I think, Adam, in a way.
But it lives on.
It lives on, I say, in the sense that it comes back from time to time. I mean, there's echoes of Charney's hypothesis that come back from time to time in some development projects. And so without... I don't want to disparage the efforts to reduce negative impacts of environmental change. But this lack of connecting to I think we have an issue as climate scientists, as I see it, in really communicating how large scale the climate is and how influences on the climate are much bigger than we can experience daily. I don't know if that's an issue that I see. And so it's much easier, and in some ways it has been a positive influence. It's much easier to think, if locally I did some damage, I can remedy it. And so I think it's been a positive response in that sense to, for example, the droughts in the 70s in the Sahel. They really affected the agrarian societies of the time. And so there was some migration, for example, from villages to cities. But there were also people who stayed back and implemented what they knew about, or went back to what they knew about local knowledge systems of managing the landscape, and were extremely successful in adapting to this new climate regime. And so it goes both, I guess it goes in both senses, you could say, at least, even though in the end it's not founded really on our understanding of the system, this putting the blame on farmers and pastoralists in some places actually had a positive effect of a response and a return to a local knowledge and understanding of the climate and environmental system, and what people term sometimes a regreening.
So there can be many reasons why one should plant trees or whatever,
Yeah.
but it's just but you
Now
want
it's an issue if you think so. The issue is if you think that by planting trees you're gonna have rainfall come back.
right.
I think.
Yeah.
So that's the issue I see for us climate scientists, not being able to communicate this understanding that if you're planting trees, you're not going to bring back rains.
Right.
But you could be adapting, it could still be adaptive strategies in many different ways, in that you can reduce temperature increase, or maybe also not just planting trees, but what people do locally is termed more like agroforestry, or there's lots of local knowledge around soil and water conservation that makes more efficient use of rainfall in times when rainfall is more variable. And so, there's lots of lessons to be learned. But this question of desertification and of the encroachment of the Sahara, I don't have much hope personally that we're ever going to be able to say that's not how the system works. I don't know.
And I guess we should mention, I mean, that this idea has much deeper historical roots. You were reminding me last night that, I mean, some of the earliest things written about the notion of human-induced climate change, long before anybody thought about carbon dioxide, were about how deforestation, or more generally changes in land use and land cover, would affect climate locally, and that this goes back all the way to Columbus, at least. I can't reconstruct, the references there, but I know that it's there's a long history of this idea that not predates anything about the Sahel or the particular instance that we're talking about. So it's somehow very and it's not completely wrong, both in the ways that you said it, and there's some cases where in some kinds of climates where what's growing on the ground or not growing on the ground does have an effect on the weather and the climate locally. But it's not. But we now understand things at a much more planetary scale.
Yeah, so the reference, if you want to make the reference, that's something I learned when I moved over here to Paris. It's a book by Frestos and Locher on
I
it's
think
history
I have seen
of
it now.
and so it's from the times of Columbus onwards. This recurrent concern with the state of the land cover and its potential effect on climate.
Yeah. And are you still working on this subject?
On Sahel?
Yeah.
Yes, in different ways. Yeah, there's some climate components now that are about the future, if you like.
Yeah.
Because there's a bit of an entanglement there in this 20th century between the warming associated with greenhouse gases and the cooling associated with pollution, with aerosols.
Yeah.
And in some ways, both seem to concur with drought. And so it's hard to disentangle that. And so disentangle that and really come to terms with the fact that, in fact, an increase in greenhouse gases and just the pure warming side of things could actually lead to more abundant rains, which in the end is what we're seeing day to day. I guess there's an article, I think, in New York Times today that talked about flooding in Nigeria, like really extensive flooding in Nigeria. So
have the models?
In any case, that's what we see recurrently now across the region. It's flooding every rainy season. There's flooding somewhere. Yeah, and then maybe we can go back later to to what extent it's climate, to what extent it's other things, because clearly.
Well, let's do that now. So I mean, when I first got interested, I mean, I learned about I knew your work when you defended your thesis, and since then, but in the early mid 2000s. I was engaged in this subject a little while with our mutual friend and colleague Michela Biasutti, who's worked on this ever since, including with you to some degree. And at that time, the climate models, projections of the future in the Sahel were just all over the place. Yes. Some said it's going to get much wetter, some said it's going to get much drier, and everything in between. Yeah. And nobody had any clue what to believe. It's my impression that there's been a little settling down of that. I mean, that the models are agreeing a little more on a wetter future, except in Senegal, the sort of western,
very westernmost
part of the Sahel, which doesn't necessarily make it right. Sometimes the models can agree on something and still be wrong. But do you have any? Do you feel that the confidence is increased?
My sense is that it could go that way because warming, if you look to paleoclimate, it wasn't the same kind of warming, but warming usually is associated with stronger monsoons, whether it be it more humidity or stronger, really, circulation.
Right.
And so even this fact of this, what we call dipole between the center east and the very westernmost Sahel, I think you could understand in terms again of the large scale circulation adjusting to warming.
Yeah. So that means there's an increase in
just
flood risk.
Yeah.
But all told, it'd probably be better to have that than a repeat
again,
of this drought like it was in the 70s and 80s.
And so, for example, in rural settings, again, I think this idea of soil and water conservation and making efficient use of rainfall or capturing rains or all forms of that would be beneficial. The issue that that we could go back to is the fact that in fact in these 50 years since 72, the region has changed dramatically. I mean, I've been going to parts of the Sahel for 20 years now, and I mean the rate of urbanization is, I don't think it's something that we can conceive of without seeing, but so it's not, I don't think it's the rural Sahel that I even saw in the movies 30 years ago anymore. If you go to Senegal, 50% of the people in Senegal live in towns, are urban. And so...
And as opposed to what in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah,
Much less.
I don't know,
Yeah.
I mean, Dakar has exploded, and that's part of the reason. It's an interesting connection, in fact. It's some colleagues in Senegal have looked into it in detail. Things kind of go together in that this urbanization and some of this explosion of cities, and take Dakar as an example, the capital of Senegal, happened during the droughts. And so people just built, with...
Was that part of the reason that people were...
Possibly, there's also a more complex... I think possibly, but there's also certainly the global economic constraints. But so one side of it is that Dakar really grew, it used to be a small part of this, the westernmost peninsula of Africa on the Atlantic Ocean, and now it's the whole peninsula, so it must have grown 10, I don't know how many folds. And because it was dry, people just built anywhere and everywhere. And now the places that are flooding are the low-lying places that perhaps shouldn't have been built on. And
like everywhere else in the world.
Exactly. It's not hydrogeological, so I think there's that element, but this element also of... maybe we don't need to belabor that, but I'll just say I also sense that this, what happened in the global economic system in terms of globalization, neoliberalism also affected these countries deeply. And so in the end, agriculture, which used to be the main livelihood activity, it is not remunerative enough. It's not, there's no, because some of the subsidies were lost in any case. And so, if you think of the fact that in Senegal it seems that it's the farmers who are the least food secure, then you can also see abandoning the field for the city for complementary reasons which are not climatic.
So I think we are getting, how are we doing in time? I think we shouldn't talk about Senegal at the Columbia Global Center in Paris without mentioning that the head of the weather service there is a Columbia graduate, a former student in to some extent of mine, and I guess not classmate of yours. He was a little bit after you. But Ousmane
definitely
Daye,
a colleague of mine at IRI.
His name is Ousmane Daye. He was a student at Columbia and then got his PhD there and worked at the IRI for many years and is now doing great work as the head of the weather service there. So maybe someday he'll make it here, or maybe he has already. I don't know, and can do one of these. I know that I think it was maybe in 21 there was a recent year where the weather service in Senegal made a seasonal forecast of a good monsoon, and so the government responded to that and invested heavily in more seeds and fertilizer, whatever, and it had a banner harvest, which resulted in big kudos from the president of the Weather Service. So we
Yes.
were all very happy to
Proud
see
of
that.
it.
That's what IRI's mission is about, right?
Yeah, I mean, Usman has definitely taken that to new heights, his engagement really at all levels, including going to farmer communities and listening to their understanding of how climate affects them, and also being able to provide useful information is really an example for everybody.
Right. Not just science, but deep stakeholder engagement is what it takes to make it usable. Right.
Yeah.
He's doing that. So I don't know if there's any. Yeah.
You can go include if you.
Yeah.
Well,
So
that's good. Yeah.
I think we covered it. I don't know. Is there anything else we should be talking about while we're here?
About the climate. No.
You want to advertise any new research coming out or any no?
No, not really. No, maybe I'll just add that, so in addition to the climate work, this work that I just briefly mentioned about food security, I did, maybe we can go into that a little bit, Adam, the interdisciplinarity of science and research, because, I've been fortunate to have connected with an early career scientist from West Africa originally, who was a postdoc at the Earth Institute at Columbia just before I left. And she's a social scientist, an anthropologist or a human ecologist. And so we had this common interest of trying to understand if we could connect this regreening of the Sahel to improved food security. And so we haven't gone all the way to, but at least these studies that we did on food security and the influence of climate on food security and the influence of livelihoods, the constraints that livelihoods pose on this relationship, I couldn't have done without her.
What's her name?
She's Elizabeth Ilbudo-Nebier, and
She's still at Columbia?
no, in fact, she left Columbia and then she got nabbed by Arizona State University. She's an assistant professor there now.
Right. Arizona State nabbed a lot of our people because the president used to be the de facto Earth Institute director in the old days.
But we still work. We're still collaborating because it's an interesting topic, and we do want to see this idea of connecting food security to the regreening of the Sahel in the sense of this the more like the action on the part of humans is something that actually goes back to some readings that we came across that detailed the food security crisis in Niger in 2005, I think it was, where people said in Niger there's a lot of this. It's in pockets in places, but there's some of this regreening that people associate with agroforestry. So with farmers letting certain species of trees grow on their fields because some species of trees are beneficial in terms of nutrients to the fields, but also sometimes also because they provide nutrition for humans and for animals. And so we're not there yet, but we would like to see if there's a way to connect this human-induced local regreening and food security.
What's the methodology? How do you work with a social scientist on this?
How do we...
Is this something I
don't know. What do we know? We kind of... Well, I mean, what's essential is to discuss openly. Each one brings their own methods to the work. And we discuss openly and we try to see where there's intersections, where there's overlap. And
what are the social science methods? I mean, are there surveys? Are there... So the climate scientist side of things is a more quantitative methods of data analysis. But we applied that. We had the way we did this was that we had household surveys from the World Food Program, or more broadly also with, I guess I shouldn't say it's just the World Food Program, but it's also government entities in Senegal. It's usually a concerted effort, and they're very extensive household surveys. There are thousands of households that are surveyed in each one of these snapshots, and then so you're combining that with climate information.
So what we were lucky with in that case is that we had 3 of these surveys, and these surveys are usually taken during normal times, not crisis or not emergency, but we just lucked out that one of these surveys actually ended up being at the tail end of a very bad, like a very deficient rainy season globally in Senegal, and so a very bad harvest. And so we could compare this bad year globally for Senegal with some good years around it, and we came up with some measures, some metrics of food security, and we could really see the difference in the data. So it's nothing astounding in terms of conclusions, but seeing it in the data, it has a different feel to it, definitely.
Great.
And so, but yeah, working interdisciplinarily, I think it's mostly trying to find where the common points are, and then each one teaching the other their part, Or
it takes time. It's hard to establish these projects quickly because you don't have to come in with a shared understanding.
You have to really make an effort, and But when you have a problem of common interest, I think that's where you can really succeed and move things forward, because you really have a demand-driven, we would like to say, an IRI question that propels the research, and then each one puts their bits and pieces, and then you create a bigger picture.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have enough.
I guess we covered it. That's good for the Center of Ideas and Imagination.
Well, thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Ali.
It's a pleasure.
Okay.